Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Uh, for this particular video, we're going to be looking at period 8, 1945 to 1980. This is the time period immediately following World War II, all the way up to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. This video will focus mostly on foreign policy. There's going to be a little bit of domestic impact with our decisions with regards to foreign policy. And we'll look at how some of that is impacting things at home. But in general, we're really just going to focus on America's relationship with the rest of the world during this particular video. Now, keep in mind, these videos are extremely important. You really need to focus on these videos for the content for your exams. I'll be taking a lot of questions from you or for your exams from these videos. So it's vital that you take notes. If I point something out, it's really important for you uh, to know and understand. So please make sure that you're paying attention to the videos. I'll try to keep them short and to the point. Now, the big thing to keep in mind for the United States with regards to foreign policy is up to this point in world history, the United States has tried to stay pretty much isolationist. There have been some very substantial exceptions to that, obviously. But in general, they've kept the policy that George Washington advocated for in his farewell address, where he said we need to stay neutral and not get involved in entangling alliances. The United States has, for the most part, tried to do that. After World War II, that's going to be impossible. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, the United States is now a nuclear power, the nuclear power in the world. So that's pretty significant. They're the most powerful nation in the world. And with that title comes some responsibility of having to be an engaged party on the world stage. Two, you've always had this giant ocean, a couple of giant oceans that have separated the United States from the rest of the world. And those have played significant roles in keeping the United States isolationist. As technology has improved, communication and travel technology, those oceans for the most part, are becoming smaller, and they're becoming less significant in terms of allowing for the United States to stay isolationist. So those are the main reasons why they're not going to be isolationist anymore. They're not going to be able to just sit back and watch what goes on throughout the world. They're going to have to be actively engaged. The big reason, though, is because of this nuclear power that they have now become. Now, the overarching policy that the United States is going to implement is called containment, and it will be articulated by George Kennan. He's the guy who sort of comes up with this idea. And basically, it's the idea that wherever communism exists, the United States will let it exist. The goal is to not let it spread from those areas. So when we talk about things like North Korea, or I'm sorry, just Korea, and when we talk about Vietnam and places like that, and other areas of the world like the Middle East or Latin America, when you talk about American intervention in those places with regards to communism, it's about preventing communism from getting larger or becoming more influential in those regions. And so that is essentially American foreign policy with regards to communism and the Soviet Union in general. Most of the time, this will be done through indirect military conflict. In other words, the use of money, possibly the use of helping militarily another nation, but not necessarily allowing American troops to get involved. Most of the time, this is the policy that's going to be used. It's really going to focus on money, though. Examples of this: Truman Doctrine. Truman Doctrine, immediately following World War II, Harry Truman believed that Greece and Turkey were in danger of falling to the Soviets, falling to the communists. And so Truman gave them tons of money to help rebuild their infrastructure, sort of stabilize their economy so that they would not fall. And it was successful. So that's another thing. A lot of these indirect strategies are going to be more successful than some of the other strategies. And we'll look at that. Another example, Marshall Plan. This is sort of an extension of the Truman Doctrine. It just goes a step further. Instead of just Greece and Turkey, it's going to give billions of dollars to most of Western Europe. It's even offered to the Soviets, and they turned it down. They thought it was some sort of capitalist plot to infiltrate their society or whatever. For the Chinese Civil War, the United States is going to give money to the nationalists in 1949 who are trying to resist the communist takeover by Mao Zedong. Make sure you know his name. He was the leader of China, communist leader of China. And ultimately, this is not successful because the nationalists fall. They are removed to Taiwan, and China becomes the People's Republic of China, and it becomes a communist nation. 1949, very scary year, because you have China falls to communism and the Soviets successfully test an atom bomb. And it frightens people throughout the world because now they are a nuclear power. So that's very, very frightening. And then make sure that you know about some collective security agreements like the United Nations. We just talked about that. And then also NATO. This is completely separate from the United Nations. This is a military alliance where the United States is going to enter into an agreement with the North Atlantic nations, Western European nations, and Canada, that if they are ever attacked by the Soviets or by any hostile enemy, that these other nations will come to their aid. So it's a military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's different from from the United Nations. The CIA is going to be established during this time period, and they're going to do some things in some Latin American and Middle Eastern countries that kind of overthrow governments there to help the United States gain some kind of influence and prevent communism from spreading. So that's, even though that's kind of sounds like military conflict, it's really not. It's still an indirect way to exert American influence there. And then you're going to have the Nixon Doctrine later on. This is going to be essentially a response to Vietnam. And he's essentially going to say, look, we can't keep sending people in to fight these battles trying to resist communism. We're going to have to let you do these things on your own. And so, again, that's going to be sort of a response to the travesty of Vietnam that we'll talk about. Then we have military buildup. This is a key component to containment policy, and it's going to take place throughout the Cold War. You're going to have an arms race, especially between the United States and the Soviet Union, as the building up of weapons and military and spending on all of that, to the point that it becomes a major part of the economy. Truman is going to build up the military, especially during the Korean conflict, under the recommendations of NSC 68, where this is basically just a document that stresses the importance of having an extremely powerful military. Then you're going to have Eisenhower with his New Look policy. It is going to stress nuclear weapons, more bang for the buck. Just build up your nuclear weapons, and maybe that will intimidate the Soviets to some extent, is kind of the thinking there. And that can be seen in this threat of massive retaliation. The idea that if we build up our weapons to a certain level, the Soviets will be scared to try to attack us, or try to come at us in a direct conflict, because we'll essentially just blow them off the face of the earth. Then you've got JFK with his flexible response. This is kind of the opposite of New Look. These are kind of the opposite, because flexible response essentially said, well, it's great that we have all these powerful nuclear weapons, but if we get in a smaller conflict, we can't use those powerful nuclear weapons because we would just annihilate entire countries. So we need more conventional weapons so that we can engage in some of these smaller conflicts a little more reasonably. The space race is also part of the arms race, or the military buildup, especially after Sputnik in 1957. That's the first man-made satellite put into outer space by the Russians, and it frightened the American people. There was concerns. Could they shoot us from could they launch missiles from this satellite, from outer space? So a lot of people are terrified by this. This leads to the creation of NASA and the National Defensive Education Act, which put tons of money into math and science. And then when JFK becomes president, he gives this speech where he has this goal of putting a man on the moon, and that happens in 1969. The United States becomes the first nation to put a man on the moon. Then you have direct military conflict that takes place in which the United States will send troops into certain areas, the most famous of which are going to be Korea and Vietnam. Korea is going to be successful. There are debates about the strategy there. The 38th parallel is what separates North and South Korea. This was a limited war, and it led to some conflict within the government at higher levels of the government. But ultimately here, containment is achieved. This war was fought during Truman and Eisenhower's administrations, and ultimately it's a relatively successful mission. However, Vietnam is not very successful. Vietnam, there was a slow buildup of our involvement in Vietnam, but then Lyndon Johnson is the president when the Gulf of Tonkin incident takes place, where supposedly the United States was attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. Lyndon Johnson makes this claim, and this, by the way, it's pretty debatable as to whether or not this even happened. In fact, it was very likely a lie. But he gets Congress to essentially give him a blank check. Make sure you know that term. Blank check. As far as his power goes. So essentially he can send as many troops and spend as much money as he wants on any type of conflict, really without even checking with Congress. And that's really not supposed to be the role here of the president. Congress is supposed to declare war, but essentially he is given the power to declare war without Congress doing it. This leads to Operation Rolling Thunder and a huge uptick in American involvement there, where the United States starts to send thousands and thousands of troops over into South Vietnam to protect them from North Vietnamese trying to overtake them and turn the whole nation into a communist nation. The American people are constantly reassured that things are going well, the war is almost over, but then there's a surprise attack, the Tet Offensive, and this was a disaster for the United States and the South Vietnamese, and it shows the American people that things are not as they have been led to believe, and it kind of leads to greater distrust of the government, and people become very concerned about our involvement in Vietnam. They were already concerned, but this just kind of amps it up a little bit, and you see nationwide campus protests on college campuses, and a lot of you see the development of hawks and doves, people who support the war, people who are anti-war, and the war becomes just a symbol of the strife of the American society of the 60s, and it was sort of a flashpoint as a result of this. Basically, all of these strategies are strategies that were used to try to contain communism, to prevent it from spreading into other parts of the world. There was never, I say there was never. There were some people who were trying to push back against containment by saying that the United States should go a step further and start to attack communism where it was and try to push back some of the gains that the Soviets had made. But for the most part, those calls were kind of ignored because it was thought that it was just too dangerous of a game to play to try to remove the gains that the Soviets had made throughout the Cold War. Now, throughout the Cold War, there's going to be different periods of what is known as détente. This is essentially a relaxation of tensions between the two superpowers. Coexistence. Sometimes it's because they recognize that things are getting a little bit there's too much conflict, and they're so powerful that they could literally end the world, so they kind of back off. But the first thaw of the Cold War happened under Eisenhower, where he calls for a relaxation of tensions and a reduction in the arms race with Nikita Khrushchev, who was his Soviet counterpart. He came up with this Atoms for Peace program. Essentially, this was the idea that the United States would share non-military nuclear technology with other nations to help them with their, technology needs and things of that nature, in the hopes that the United States would still be able to dominate the nuclear stratosphere, but also sort of win the hearts and minds of some of the people and some of the nations throughout the world, and the United States would have more influence there. Eisenhower also meets with Soviet leaders at Geneva. This time period becomes known as the Spirit of Geneva, this relaxation of tensions. However, this is ruined by a U-2 spy plane. The United States was flying spy planes over the Soviet Union to just see what kind of technology they had, things of that nature, and it gets shot down. And that pretty much ends this period of détente. Then we have the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Actually, that's not when it was. It was a little before that. But regardless, the Cuban Missile Crisis takes place. And this happens during Kennedy administration. And this is pretty much the closest the United States and the Soviet Unions will come to direct conflict with one another and all-out nuclear war. It happens over the course of a couple of weeks. You essentially have the United States sees that with the use of U-2 spy planes, they see that the Soviets have been installing nuclear capabilities, rocket capabilities in Cuba, and the United States. These missiles have the ability to reach multiple cities as far west as like Houston and Dallas, as far north as possibly New York City, maybe even Chicago. So they have the ability to wipe out cities with these weapons. And so this leads to a huge conflict. There's a blockade of Cuba by the United States, and tensions are on the rise between the United States and the Soviet Union. Ultimately, they come to an agreement where the United States agrees to remove weapons out of Turkey, and the Soviets will agree to remove weapons out of Cuba. This will lead to a direct hotline being installed between the two nations, between D.C. and Washington. And I think I said it happened before 62. It was in October of 62. So that's when the Cuban Missile takes place, Cuban Missile Crisis. Also, another time period of détente is really one of the most important ones. Think of Richard Nixon and think of China in the 1970s. There's this big rivalry between China and the Soviet Union, and Nixon wants to try to exploit that. And in February of 72, Nixon becomes the first U.S. president to meet with the Chinese leader, Mao Zedong. And it kind of sort of opens things up a little bit between the Chinese and the United States. Nixon will also be a part of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, in which he comes to an agreement. They decide to limit nuclear weapons, and then they have further talks with SALT II, but that's ruined when the Soviets invade Afghanistan in 1979. So these are time periods of détente where things are kind of relaxed. Things are not as tense between the two world powers. So just think of the time period with Eisenhower. Think of the time period immediately following Cuban Missile Crisis, and think of the time period with Nixon as president going into China, and then the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Those are examples of détente.